Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman. Paris Schutz has the evening off. On the show tonight,
I want to particularly thank the governor of Illinois and the mayor of Highland Park for being here.
the president touts a new gun safety law a week after the Highland Park shooting. Plus, Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle at the White House today. She joins us with more on that new law. Health professionals warn the overturning of Roe v. Wade could negatively impact the maternal mortality rate.
We're thinking of Brittney Griner at this time. She remains a huge priority for us.
Brittney Griner takes center stage at the WNBA All-Star Game, even though she's not at center court in person. A look at the developments on her detainment in Russia.
This is an open murder case.
The discovery of an unserved warrant in the 1955 kidnapping of Emmett Till. Hear from one of Till's relatives on what she wants to see happen. The historic Palmer House is a step closer to a foreclosure sale. That and more from Cranes.
The thing about Grace and Frankie that has been so much fun is it's so challenging.
And we check back in with the Evanston artist behind Netflix's longest-running original series, Grace and Frankie. But first, some of today's top stories. Illinois was well represented today at a White House ceremony celebrating the first major gun legislation in 30 years. Governor J.B. Pritzker, Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering, Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle, and other Illinois elected officials were there for today's ceremony. The event comes 1 week after the Highland Park shooting that left 7 people dead. We'll have more on the potential impact of the gun law, as well as a one-on-one with Toni Preckwinkle coming up. Mayoral candidate and 15th Ward Alderman Ray Lopez is in Israel to learn about ways to handle public safety issues. Lopez and others from the 2022 Hispanic Community Leaders Delegation flew to Israel to look at how the Israelis deal with random acts of violence and terrorism and how they create safety zones around schools. The group was invited by Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is part of an American-Israel Friendship League trip. Northwestern University's president-elect is stepping down for health reasons. Economist Rebecca Blank was set to become the university's next president, but is stepping back after being diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. Outgoing President Morton Shapiro has agreed to remain as president while the university searches for a replacement. Blank and her husband are returning to the Madison area for her cancer treatment. Up next, more on today's White House ceremony for the first major federal gun law signed in decades. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabee family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
It's been exactly 1 week since 7 people lost their lives when they were gunned down at Highland Park's Independence Day parade. While the community mourns, the focus has also changed to action, like what difference a new federal bipartisan gun law could make. Illinois officials were on hand in D.C. to commemorate the recent signing of that law. Amanda Venneke joins us now with more. Amanda.
Yeah, Brandis, Highland Park marked that grim 1 week anniversary with the tolling of bells, 7 chimes, 1 for each of the fallen victims. Also, a moment of silence at 10:14 this morning. That's the time when a week ago, the first emergency calls came in reporting the deadly barrage of bullets. State Representative Bob Morgan was at the parade. He was actually marching in it with his wife and young children. He says they were 2 blocks away and could hear the gunfire.
It's all horrible and it's all playing out slowly, and picking up the pieces, making sure we're getting the resources to where we need to. And it's there's the initial adrenaline pushing you through the first few days, and now it's making sure we move on and also push hard as we possibly can for the change so that no one else goes through what we're going through right now.
I talked to Morgan while he was at the airport. Don't know if you could tell. He was on his way back from D.C. He was among the officials from both Highland Park and elsewhere in Illinois at the White House event. It was a gun control commemoration of the new federal gun law, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Representatives from other communities recently besieged by mass shootings were there too.
We finally moved that mountain, a mountain of opposition, obstruction, and indifference that stood in the way and stopped every effort at gun safety for 30 years in this nation. Now's the time to galvanize this movement, because that's our duty to the people of this nation. That's what we owe those families in Buffalo, where a grocery store became a killing field. It's what we owe those families in Uvalde, where an elementary school became a killing field. That's what those families in Highland Park, where on July 4th a parade became a killing field.
The bipartisan safety communities law is intended to prevent gun violence by supporting and helping fund states' red flag measures. Those are the measures intended to keep guns out of the hands of those who a judge deems dangerous, even though, as the Highland Park shooting has exposed, there have been gaps in Illinois' red flag law that kept it from working in that instance. The federal law also requires convicted domestic abusers to be logged in the criminal background check system, requires juvenile and mental health records be checked before somebody under the age of 21 can purchase a gun. Also, what Morgan says that he is particularly hopeful will make a difference, it creates federal penalties for cross-state gun runners and straw purchasers.
We're really close to the Wisconsin border, so the amount of guns that are coming through our border into places like Highland Park, there's a lot of weapons that are coming from other states that have lax or almost no gun laws or restrictions. So having meaningful reforms and meaningful laws and penalties for those who are shipping guns across state lines, I think it's going to be very important.
But critics say the package does not go far enough, and that was a point driven home by a man who interrupted the White House event.
Make no mistake. Sit down, you'll hear what I have to say. If you think you...
I've been trying to tell you this for years.
Now, that man is the father of a teen who was killed in the Parkland High School shooting in 2018. He explained his frustrations on CNN, saying there is no reason to be celebrating this federal gun law.
That using the word celebration, getting together, it's like we're going to a party, to a wedding today, we're all receiving invitations. And meanwhile, you can see these mothers in Uvalde that just saw how their kids were massacred inside the school. So for me, it's not only not enough what we're passing.
Lots of talk, including from the president, calling this action a first step, seeing as Congress could not work out a deal that would ban military-grade weapons and high-capacity magazines. Now, Highland Park does have an assault weapons ban, and Mayor Rotering says it's time that the rest of the country catches up. She gave some advice on a path to political compromise.
We all share a love of helping our children grow up in a clean and safe society. We also share a love and appreciation for our first responders. Our first responders are outgunned by these combat weapons. I think if people listen to what has happened week after week after week in our communities and recognize that this is not what our freedom was fought for, we are in fact going in reverse. There is no reason that people need to have combat weapons. If they want to support the Second Amendment, that's their choice. Combat weapons were not originally intended by the framers.
She and the governor had a brief private meeting with the president. Pritzker saying that additional action on the federal level is urgent.
And I realize the work that was done to get the Safer Communities Act passed and signed. It's great that we got progress, but we've done many of those things already in the state of Illinois. We're an outlier in that way. We've gotten some of those things done already. But we need much more done, because banning assault weapons just in the city of Highland Park or just in the state of Illinois won't effectively keep assault weapons from coming into the streets of Illinois.
Illinois does not have a statewide ban on assault-style rifles. Now, meanwhile, Pritzker's opponent in November's general election scolded him in a statement. GOP nominee for Governor Darren Bailey says that lives depend on Pritzker catching criminals and keeping families safe. J.B. Pritzker is in D.C. hobnobbing with his elite friends when he should be home answering for his soft-on-crime bills. This morning, 6 men were in a shootout in the South Loop, which is starting to look like the OK Corral. This is sure to be something we'll hear about, Brandis, leading up to November, a whole lot more. The governor, by the way, has said that among the actions he thinks Illinois has to take is fixing up those exposed gaps in Illinois' red flag law. Back to you.
Amanda, thank you. And as we just heard, a number of Illinois politicians were at the White House today as President Joe Biden celebrated the passage of a new gun safety law. One of them was Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle, who joins us now from D.C. Madam President, thanks again for joining us. First, let's get into this event that was at the White House today. What did you make of it and of what you heard from President Biden?
Well, I was very, very grateful to have an invitation from the president. It was elected officials, advocates, and survivors, and it was a very moving occasion. And the president spoke eloquently about the importance of this legislation and the work that needs to be done.
Now, also, we know that the public clearly favors more gun control measures because what was signed today was passed by Congress before the tragedy in Highland Park a week ago. And even today, one of the fathers of the Parkland shooting victims spoke out during the president's speech, calling for more to be done. You know, being in D.C. today, do you get the sense that we'll see more significant action on guns in the near future?
Well, we haven't had, sensible gun legislation come out of Congress in 30 years. So this is a pretty important milestone. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And unfortunately, most of those who are in favor of sensible gun laws are Democrats. And until we change significantly the balance in the Senate, I think we're going to have a tough time.
What more would you like to see?
Well, I think we need a national ban on assault weapons. But as President Biden spoke today, we also need to make considerable investments in mental health services. If we look at the troubled history of the young man allegedly involved in the Highland Park shootings, there's clearly points of intervention that should have been taken. And I think we also need to invest in the communities that are struggling the most with the violence. So on one hand, we need gun laws, but on the other hand, we need to invest in our people, both in their good mental health and in the communities in which so many live that are marginalized and where people despair.
And to that end, we know that, given that many of the guns used to commit crimes in Cook County, they come from surrounding states with looser gun laws. What more can you do in Cook County to tighten that flow of guns?
Well, this is an issue I think that we need to take up at the national level. As I said, if we had national gun laws, there wouldn't be such an issue between Illinois as a haven for reasonable gun legislation and the surrounding states where folks, make straw purchases and then come into Illinois and sell their guns. So we've got to have national legislation. And as I said, we need investments in mental health and in communities that are struggling with the violence, economic development in the communities that are struggling with the violence. So it's a combination. It has to be a multi-pronged strategy, a combination of ways in which we address this issue.
So shifting to Cook County more specifically, last month you released the preliminary budget forecast for the next year. You project a budget shortfall of just over $18 million. Overall, how would you say the financial picture looks for Cook County?
Well, when I came into office in 2010, we had a budget gap of $487 million to close, so this is pretty good. I just want to commend my chief financial officer, Amar Ritsky, who recently left us to go to the Obama Presidential Center, Ivan Samstein, and all of the folks in our chief financial office, CFO's office, for their good work over the last almost a little bit more than a decade. It's put us in a very good place, even in this difficult moment with the pandemic and the economic collapse that followed, to have a balanced budget. And we've done that every year in my tenure, and I'm proud of the good work done by our finance team.
You've said that you intend to prioritize equity in your budget process. Cook County has received over $1 billion from the federal government through the American Rescue Plan Act. How's that money going towards specifically towards your goals of achieving equity?
Well, at the insistence of my chief of staff, Lynetta Haynes-Turner, we spent a year trying to figure out what made the most sense in terms of investment. We put together our American Rescue Plan Act initiatives and we've begun to distribute the money this summer, and particularly begun to distribute our violence prevention, anti-recidivism, and restorative justice resources. But we're going to be making investments in behavioral health services. Our Cook County Department of Public Health and Cook County Health System for 180 years have provided quality care to residents of Cook County, regardless of their ability to pay, their documentation status, their race, religion, their sexual orientation. But we have always focused more on physical health than mental health, and we need to ramp up our behavioral health services. We're also going to have a guaranteed income pilot, the largest one in the country, $42 million invested in this demonstration program over 2 years. And we're also going to try to do something about medical debt, address the challenges that families face around paying their medical bills. It's the primary reason that ordinary working people end up in bankruptcy. So in addition to the investments that I've talked about previously in communities, economic and community development investments, infrastructure investments, and violence prevention investments, we're going to be investing in those three things as well.
Okay, so there's been a delay in sending out property tax bills. That could lead to shortfalls for Cook County cities, villages, fire, library, school districts. You announced a plan last week to create a bridge funding program to provide loans to taxing districts in Cook County. Reports that the funding can total between $300 and $500 million. Is that enough to support those taxing bodies?
Well, some of our taxing bodies are in great fiscal shape and have considerable cash reserves to tide them over. Others are struggling and don't have that same resource. And so we're going to provide this bridge fund to enable those folks without interest, it'll be no interest loans, to have the resources they need to carry on their functions and operations.
Now, the assessor's office and the Board of Review, they're sort of blaming each other for this delay in getting those property tax bills out. What's your understanding of why the bills haven't been sent out yet and how soon that might be resolved?
Well, we've had in Cook County pretty archaic technology. A lot of our data was stored on a mainframe computer. That's I don't think you'd find that anyplace else in the private sector and surely in most of government. So we've been investing a lot in technology, and those technology investments now have come to the property tax arena, and they began in the assessor's office. They're going to move to the Board of Review. So the technology changes that we had to make, which were long overdue, when it kicked in this last year or so, that led to some delays as we transferred over. And frankly, in the pandemic, it was very difficult to do the kind of operations that we normally do that lead to getting the bills out on time. So, I'm hopeful that after we get through this difficult year, we'll be in a better path to return to our pattern for almost a decade of getting the bills out on time. And by the way, when I came in 2010, I discovered that we hadn't gotten the second tax bills out in a timely fashion in more than 3 decades. So we had not met the legal requirement for 3 decades, and we worked hard for a year to try to put everything in place to do that, and we did. And then we kind of got challenged by the pandemic in a really serious way in our efforts to improve our technology.
Madam President, you're in D.C. for a few more days this week, attending some other events with the Biden administration. What do you hope to accomplish?
Well, we'll be on a panel tomorrow talking about our American Rescue Plan initiatives, and in particular, how we intend to work with the academic community to evaluate and analyze the results of the investments that we make. And I look forward to tomorrow and the panel presentation that we'll be making, as well as other activities. We're going to try to be meeting with a few people in the congressional delegation if we're able. So this is going to be a working trip, and I'm very grateful, as I said, for the opportunity that we had today to join President Biden and Vice President Harris to talk about this critical issue of gun safety and addressing the violence in our country.
Okay. Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle in Washington, D.C. for us. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Researchers say the Supreme Court's move overturning Roe v. Wade could have a negative impact on maternal health. This as new research shows the national rate of maternal mortality increased by more than 18% between 2019 and 2020 and nearly 17% in 2020, the year the pandemic first struck. And the rates of Black and Latino women dying during or within 42 days of pregnancy were even higher. Here to talk about this and explain the correlation between lack of access to abortion care and maternal mortality are Dr. Erica Hinz, Associate Professor and Doctor of Obstetrics and Gynecology for the University of Illinois, Chicago, and Dr. Sadia Haider, Director of the Division of Family Planning at Rush University Medical Center. Thank you both for joining us. Dr. Haider, let's start with you. So let's compare the mortality rates in developed nations, and the numbers are pretty stark. The U.S. stands at 23.8 deaths per 100,000 live births, compared to France, just below the U.S., stands at 8.7 deaths. New Zealand at 1.7 deaths. What do we know about why maternal mortality rates continue to rise in the last 3 years?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I think the real issue is that there are significant health and social inequities that exist across our healthcare system. When speaking about maternal mortality in particular and morbidity, we have identified factors that contribute to this, including lack of access to quality, comprehensive reproductive health care. We've got structural racism, bias within our healthcare system, and just in general, lack of continuity of care. All of these factors result in higher rates of maternal morbidity and mortality and postpartum inequities, as you've described in terms of the rates here in the United States. These are all significantly higher among patients that are of lower income, again, correlating with the lack of access, as well as those patients that are from Black and other indigenous populations, which have been, again, facing some of the ongoing healthcare inequities related to structural racism, et cetera. So I would say those are the main factors that we recognize as contributing to maternal morbidity and mortality in our country.
Dr. Hinz, what are some of the medical factors across the board, no matter a racial or ethnic background, but what are some of the factors that lead to a mother dying during or sometime after childbirth?
Sure, that's a great question. So currently in the United States, some of the most common causes are cardiovascular conditions, infection, and high blood loss or hemorrhage. My fear as an OBGYN and one who specializes in this care is that with the banning of abortion in the United States happening all around us, that unsafe abortion will become one of the factors contributing to maternal mortality, similar to pre-Roe.
And let's take that a little bit further, Dr. Haider. How can limited or no access to abortion impact maternal mortality?
Yeah, also very good question. So we know that already limited access to abortion is prevalent in certain communities even prior to the overturning of Roe, which has resulted in patients, specifically, again, lower income, those from Black and Black backgrounds, as well as people of color, being disproportionately affected. And we think the inequities will then be exacerbated with lack of abortion access. We know from studies that states that have restrictive legislation have higher rates of maternal morbidity and mortality. There's evidence to show that there's a correlation. So with the restriction of abortion access, these disparities in maternal morbidity and mortality will be increased. We've already seen this happen in those states that are restrictive, and this will continue to be exacerbated. We also know that those are the same states with the least supportive maternal health policies and the lowest sort of poverty levels affecting patients of color.
Dr. Hinz, anti-abortion critics say that the CDC data upon which some of this research is based is incomplete and that you can't draw this link between abortion bans and maternal mortality. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that we can't 100% say there's a causality. We do know consistently that over decades, the research has consistently shown that, number one, marginalized communities are the ones that are bearing the brunt of all of these abortion bans and restrictions. And then number two, that these abortion restrictive states, like Dr. Haider mentioned, have higher maternal mortality rates. There's definitely a correlation, and we are continuing to research it as we speak.
Dr. Haider, do you expect to see higher increases in maternal mortality, particularly in states that we know have trigger laws or abortion bans already in place?
Yeah, I do. I think this is reflected in the evidence that we've seen previously, that in states with restrictive legislation already existing have higher rates of maternal morbidity and mortality. And again, those are many factors. I think those patients with complex medical conditions will continue pregnancies that maybe they might not have otherwise. And those conditions often will be exacerbated during their continuation of their pregnancy. Higher rates of maternal morbidity are expected in some of these states. I think there's already data collected on certain contexts, potentially, and I think there's some data coming out of Texas already showing this. So we do anticipate this.
So as we've discussed, maternal mortality rates obviously higher in the Black and Latino populations. So looking at a chart that we've got here, we can see the difference in rates before the pandemic, and it's pretty clear. If we take a look at the second chart showing the rates during the pandemic, another clear increase. Dr. Hens, what can be done about this? What needs to be done? What would you like to see?
Well, first of all, removal of the bans and limiting abortion access and reproductive health care. But I also think it's really important to think about pregnancy is not the end point. There's postpartum care. There's support of families to thrive and survive in their communities and live safe and healthy lives. So things like paid family medical leave, affordable housing, affordable childcare. These are all things that go into one's reproductive health journey. And so I think looking just at abortion bans isn't the full picture. We need to look at all of the policies impacting reproductive health care.
Dr. Hyder, you know, we've known, or Hayter, excuse me, we've known about the severity of our maternal mortality rates for some time. What has been done in the last few years to reduce them, and how do you look at that, considering the rates have still increased?
Yeah, it's really concerning, and I think we in Illinois are, lucky and fortunate that we do have supportive policies and we're moving in the right direction. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. So some of the things that we have done in Illinois is expanded Medicaid coverage to allow for coverage up to 1 year postpartum. We have also, which allows patients to continue getting care when needed. There are a number of things across Illinois that are happening. We at Rush are taking part in a Illinois Perinatal Quality Collaborative, specifically focusing on this issue of birth equity, where we're actually looking at hospital level data in a disaggregated way to really hone in on what are the issues that we should address more closely in these specific populations that are most affected. We haven't done this before systematically. We also have a number of trainings that we are doing to really look at our bias in within our medical system, which is necessary to really build holistic, comprehensive care practices without bias. And then I think a number of programs are being instituted to kind of meet patients where they're at. So a lot of our patients are unable to come back to the hospital routinely postpartum. There are home visiting programs such as the Family Connects program, which is a nursing home visiting program. We are a pilot program for that here at Rush. So the number of initiatives that are underway, I think there's a lot more work to be done. It needs to continue. But these are some of the solutions that are underway.
Okay, that's where we'll have to leave it. My thanks to Dr. Erica Hens and Dr. Sadia Hayter for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Up next, meet the Evanston-based artist behind Netflix's Grace and Frankie series. Stay with us.
For the last... Much of the story of Latinos in America is that of entrepreneurship. About 5 million Latino-owned businesses currently exist in the U.S.
Predominantly Latino communities often bear the environmental burden of heavy industry. Residents of those communities say they have a hard time making their concerns heard.
A Chicago-based photographer has a personal understanding of immigration, and he has spent years documenting small businesses.
The forces of gentrification can make people being priced out of their neighborhoods feel powerless. But the founders of Lolita's Bodega say residents have more power than they think.
And there's much more ahead on the program, including a look at the fight to bring WNBA player Brittney Griner back home. But first, it's been about 3 years since we introduced you to the artist behind the artwork on the hit Netflix series Grace and Frankie. With the show's final season officially out, arts correspondent Angel Edo figured it was time to take us back to the artist studio in East Rogers Park for a visit.
For the last 8 years, Nancy Rosen has created the artwork behind Netflix's longest-running original series, Grace and Frankie.
When Grace and Frankie calls, it's always a Hollywood emergency. And, so, I just kind of go, they call, and then my life is like, my husband watches my head and it goes click, click, click. And that's the thing about doing a painting for them. If it's for an episode, that it starts out one thing and it keeps morphing until it's done.
But those chaotic clicks were put on hold when the pandemic forced production to shut down after creating the first 4 episodes of the final season. Rosen says this pause allowed her to work on personal projects, some she'd never have done if it weren't for the series.
I did a whole series of dogs because I did the poodles for them, and then somebody said to me, would you do a portrait of my dog? And normally I'd be like, no. but painting the dog was so much fun.
But once production resumed, it was full steam ahead.
Season 7, they hadn't called me most of the season. And then all of a sudden, it was like, this painting is as serious as a heart attack, and, and I will miss that, because it's like, I clearly, this is it for me. I'm going to do this my whole life, right?
When the show wrapped, Rosen received personal items she'd lent to production to make Frankie's art studio more personable.
So they either rented stuff from me or commissioned, like if I did the painting of Jane, that was for an episode. Mm-hmm. So they owned that painting. Mm. So these are paintings that I just loaned them.
For background
Yeah, exactly. So these all just would, like if you go and you look at Frankie's studio, these will just be in the background, kind of.
Yeah.
There's a lot of my stuff that's just, my favorite part is that her studio
is your studio.
Yes, so there's all my little stuff.
I remember you said they were like, can you send some paintbrushes?
Yeah, and my little tchotchke things that are, my old paint,
We also looked back at some memorable pieces from past seasons.
Lily loved playing Frida. So she asked me to do a painting of Frankie as Lily as Frida as Frankie. So after they finished filming, they presented Lily with the painting of Frida and Jane the painting of her as Count Drincula. That was pretty special.
Rosen says the exposure from working on Grace and Frankie over the last 8 years led her to be commissioned to create more than 800 pieces. And while she doesn't know what's next, she looks forward to continuing the work that led her to this journey.
It's like a welcome wave that came into my life and went like this and this and this and this and this, and then it's gone. And it's just left me with really lovely, wonderful feelings and knowing, I would love to do more. I like the interruption of, no, today you're going to draw a toilet, or a robot that is a woman that makes donuts, but they're really bagels with sprinkles. And you're like, oh, I've never thought of a robot in my entire life, let alone a woman robot, So I think that's what I will miss the most.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
And you can visit our website for more information on Nancy Rosen's original artwork. You can see her final works for Grace and Frankie, now playing on Netflix. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, Google names the recipients of its Startup Awards, and they include 5 local companies. That and more from Cranes. WNBA star Brittney Griner was the focus of this weekend's All-Star game in Chicago. Hear about efforts to get her back to the U.S. amid her detainment in Russia.
Justice delayed should not be justice denied.
And the discovery of an unserved warrant in the 1955 kidnapping case of Emmett Till. Hear from one of Till's relatives calling to see that warrant served. But first, some more of today's top stories. Highland Park stopped for an extended moment of silence a week after the 4th of July parade shooting. Today also marks the reopening of the street where 7 people were killed. Meanwhile, one of the smaller victims of the massacre underwent another surgery. Doctors operated on 8-year-old Cooper Roberts' esophagus. The bullet also hit his liver and abdominal aorta and exited through his back, leaving behind a severed spine. His twin brother has leg wounds from shrapnel, and Cooper's mother was shot in her legs, requiring 2 surgeries. His family reports that Cooper, quote, is in a great deal of pain physically and emotionally after he was told he's paralyzed from the waist down. A GoFundMe page has raised more than $1.3 million to help pay for his ongoing medical care and long-term rehabilitation. Participants of Chicago's Guaranteed Basic Income program have received their first round of $500 payments. The city's test will send those payments every month for a year to see whether a universal basic income could reduce poverty. Officials say approximately 61% of participants live below the poverty line, which is $26,500 for a family of 4. And 38% of participants live in households that earn half that amount. Approximately 67% of participants identified as Black and 27% as Latino or Hispanic. More than 176,000 Chicagoans applied for the program, but only 5,000 households won the lottery. And Chicago is giving away 5,000 free bikes by 2026. The Chicago Department of Transportation announced the Bike Chicago program today. 500 bikes will be distributed to age and income eligible Chicagoans during the program's first year. Applicants must be a Chicago resident, at least 14 years old, have a household income at or below 100% of the city's median income, not already own a bicycle and face mobility hardship, or be a participant in a CDOT mobility program. The Palmer House Hotel nears a foreclosure sale, but it'll likely be sold at a fraction of the property's pre-pandemic value. Meanwhile, a suburban apartment complex sees a different fate as it's sold for a record price. And Google also spins big on 5 local startups. Here to go behind the headlines is Crain's Chicago business reporter Danny Ecker. Welcome back, Danny. So tell us, what is the latest with the Palmer House, and remind us how the city's second largest hotel got to this point.
Yeah, so, the Palmer House was sort of a poster child for the distress of the downtown hotel market early in the pandemic. The New York firm that has owned it since 2005 stopped making loan payments at the onset of COVID, and its lender filed a foreclosure lawsuit back in 2020. Now a court has issued a foreclosure judgment, which is a step toward the lender taking control of the property, which then would lead likely to a sale of the hotel at what almost certainly would be a fraction of the pre-pandemic value. The hotel was appraised at $326 million in March. And for perspective, that was $560 million back in 2018. So this hotel is it's going to be kind of a bellwether for what investors think of big full-service hotels in downtown Chicago, which have been slow to recover.
Yeah, it's a significant difference in the prices there. Meanwhile, an apartment complex in suburban Palatine sold for just under $140 million. What do you know about this property and its future? And is this good news for local apartment landlords and their tenants?
Yeah, unlike hotels, apartments have been strong. This is a 612-unit apartment complex along Lake Cook Road. It's called Bourbon Square. That price is actually the most ever paid for a multifamily property in suburban Chicago. The previous record was also just set back in January in Glendale Heights. And it just shows the strength of the suburban apartment market right now. Rents are rising. They're up 17% from this time last year and sitting at record highs. And the buyer in this case is a group out of Oak Brook called Albion Residential. They're betting that that's going to continue, and they're planning to spend more than $30 million updating the property and saying, hey, but we think that rents are going to continue to rise and will add value to the property.
Okay, and lastly, Google announces the recipients of its startup awards. Danny, tell us about the funding and these 5 local startups that'll be receiving.
Yeah, Google has initiatives to support minority-owned startups. One of them is called the Latino Founders Fund. It's giving out $5 million in cash and services to help Latino entrepreneurs get their businesses up and running. 5 of the recipients, like you said, are here in Chicago. They each get $100,000 in cash. They include a couple healthcare tech companies, a finance app for small businesses, as well as a software company that provides a platform for different service providers. This is a big deal in Chicago, especially. People of color and women typically point to a lack of access to capital as a big barrier to entry for getting starting a business. So having a series of local winners here helps Chicago be able to highlight the diversity of talent in the city.
And interesting, obviously, a couple of them, like you said, healthcare startups in the wake of a pandemic that's had a disproportionate impact on the Latino community as well. Danny Ecker at Cranes, thank you so much for joining us.
All right, Brandis, thanks.
As the WNBA All-Star Game tipped off in Chicago over the weekend, one absent player's name was on many people's minds. Brittney Griner last week pleaded guilty to drug charges in a Russian court days after sending a handwritten letter to President Biden, pleading that his administration remember her case. Griner has been detained in Russia for 5 months now. Joining us now with more is TJ Quinn, an investigative reporter for ESPN. TJ, welcome back and thank you for joining us. So we know Brittney Griner, she pleaded guilty last week. What happens next in her case?
Well, the case isn't as important so much as what's going on outside the courtroom. Under a Russian criminal trial, it's not like in the U.S. where if you plead guilty, that's pretty much it. They actually continue to read the entire case into the record. So she won't be sentenced, her lawyers think, for at least another 3 weeks, could be longer than that. But what's much more important is the negotiations going on outside. The U.S. government, Brittney Griner supporters knew she was not going to get any kind of favorable remedy inside a courtroom. If she comes home, it'll be through a negotiated settlement. And to them, that's far more important. What's going on between the U.S. State Department and the Kremlin?
So you've said what's going on outside the courtroom is more important because some experts have cautioned not to get too bogged down in the details of the trial. Is that because it's a formality at this point?
It really always was. It was a foregone conclusion. First of all, if you're a normal Russian citizen with a regular criminal case, fewer than 1% of criminal cases are acquitted in Russia. It is a system built on conviction. So for a political case like this involving a high-profile American, they knew a guilty verdict was a foregone conclusion. So the calculation going into the trial was, we know she's going to be found guilty. We also know that if there's going to be a negotiated settlement, Russia will require an admission of guilt before they let her go. So the thought was, why not just go ahead and do it, hope that she gets maybe a more merciful sentence in the meantime, and that it can possibly push the negotiations along.
And TJ, remind us briefly how we got here.
Well, Brittney is one of a number of top American players who have been playing in Russia for years because, frankly, the money is much better playing for club teams there than in the WNBA, which is supposedly the highest level of basketball in the world. She was entering the country February 17th and was pulled out of line. Russian law enforcement says that they found vape cartridges containing hashish oil in them. We haven't seen evidence to show whether that's true. Word didn't come out in the U.S. that she was in detention for about 3 weeks. And from that point on, it's been, obviously very public. The people around her are quick to point out, hey, look, just because she admitted guilt in court, it's not the same as saying to the world, I really did this. To them, it's a strategy, and most people outside of Brittney Griner and whoever searched her suitcase really don't know the truth of what she tried to bring in or didn't.
So last week, Griner wrote a letter to President Biden. Here's her wife, Sherelle Griner, talking about that letter.
He did write her back, and I was able to read the letter, and it brought me so much joy, as well as BG. I believe every word that she said to him, he understood, and he sees her as a person, and he has not forgotten her, which was her biggest cry in her letter.
TJ, what do we know about the next steps from the Biden administration and the State Department?
They're keeping it very quiet. There's been some hope that there would be enough progress that Bill Richardson, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who a lot of people know has spent years working as a private citizen negotiating for the release of Americans held abroad. He's working essentially in tandem with the State Department. He's really the lead negotiator. And what they're hoping is that there's a point sometime soon when he can go over to Russia and try to secure a deal. There's been discussion about trading her for a Russian man named Victor Bout, who's been in the U.S., in a U.S. prison serving a 25-year sentence for supporting terrorism. Russia made it clear they've asked for him a number of times before, but there was an official state news agency report and TASS that said that essentially they were looking to get him. Is the U.S. willing to make a deal for a man like Victor Bout? Would they make it as possibly some kind of package deal? for Brittney Griner and another American, Paul Whelan, who's been there since December 2018, and the government also considers to be wrongfully detained. But they're keeping the details very quiet.
Now, the Russian deputy foreign minister warned Thursday that attempts by the American side to make noise in public don't help the practical settlement of issues. That last bit is in quotes. What does he mean by this? Any reason to believe it's true?
It's really hard to tell. I mean, everything that you see is considered posturing by U.S. officials and by the experts in the case. Russia, any expert I've spoken to has said they need to maintain the facade of a legitimate proceeding, that they want this to look to a domestic and international audience like it might be justice. So what they don't like is when the U.S. says this is a sham procedure. They don't like it. What Ryabkov, the minister that you referred to, has said before is, let's adjudicate the case. The Russian stance is, this is a serious trial, serious prosecution, we'll get through it, and then we'll see where we are. But the U.S., the officials I've spoken to, they describe it as posturing.
And TJ, we've got about 30 seconds, but what are some of the mitigating factors that make supporters hopeful that the Russian government will be lenient?
Well, the biggest thing, in terms of the leniency, that comes down to the timing of when they're willing to release her. And that comes down to whether or not there's a deal that both sides agree to. Brittney Griner supporters have put steady pressure on President Biden to get a deal done. Their feeling is that, you know, it's one thing when the State Department's involved, but if the President of the United States or his chief of staff call over there and say, we want this done, that's the way it's going to happen. So even after that letter back to Brittney Griner, expect there's going to still be pressure on the White House.
Okay, more to come. I'm sure you'll be keeping your eyes on it. TJ Quinn at ESPN, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Up next, a new discovery in the lynching case of Emmett Till. That's a conversation that originally aired on Chicago Tonight, Black Voices. Stay with us. In the basement of a Mississippi courthouse in late June, members of the Minnesota-based Emmett Till Legacy Foundation discovered an unserved warrant. The 1955 warrant charged Carolyn Bryant Dunham in the kidnapping of Emmett Till, a black 14-year-old from Chicago. Till was abducted, tortured, and killed after being accused of whistling at Bryant Dunham at a family store in Mississippi. Bryant Dunham's husband and his brother, were both tried and acquitted of Till's lynching. Now, the foundation, which includes members of Till's family, is demanding that the warrant be served and to see Bryant Dunham charged. Joining us now with more is Deborah Watts, Emmett Till's cousin and co-founder of the Emmett Till Legacy Foundation. Deborah, thank you for joining us. First, if you would, just explain your relationship to Emmett Till. How are you family?
I am a cousin of Emmett's and Mamie Till Mobley. Our great-grandfathers, Emmett's great-grandfather and my great-grandfather were brothers. Joe Smith was my great-grandfather, and Emmett's great-grandfather was George Smith.
Okay, and of course, we all know in the family, we're all family, no matter how far back you go. Now, you found this warrant, correct?
Well, it was found by Kali Rashid, who was with us. It was about 5 people that were with us at the time. It was Melissa Ernest, who's one of our ambassadors with the foundation, my daughter, Terry Watts, who's our PR director, along with Keith Beauchamp, who is a film director and justice advocate, and myself. So, but Kali Rashid was the one that found it actually in the lower level basement area of the LaFleur County Courthouse in Greenwood, Mississippi.
And what was that search like? How did you all gain access to the records?
We gained access with the permission of the county clerk. Jaribu Hill, who's our family counsel and attorney, requested that access. And it was initially granted towards the end of March. And Melissa Ernest, along with Keith Beauchamp, went and did an early assessment. And then we, after putting our calendars together and matching up dates, we knew we had to go back. They did an assessment, and it was determined that there was another area that needed to be searched, and that was the lower area of the basement area. And so we went with gloves, with hats, with masks on, ready to find the warrant. And within an hour and a half, Khalid Rashid was able to locate a box, looking through it, found the original file that had been there since 1955.
So you, I mean, did you know what you were looking for specifically for this particular warrant, or were you just looking to see what was there, to see what you could find?
Well, we knew that criminal cases were in a red folder, and that's where we found it. And we knew that it would be possibly, we thought, we didn't know that it would be a part of whether it's in the minute books of August 1955, or whether it would be all together. But what we were able to find is a file folder, red in color, with the minutes, along with the affidavit and the warrant inside, and then a copy of a piece of paper that had Mo's Wright's address on it. So everything was contained in that one folder. So we weren't really sure what we were going to find, but fortunately, the ancestors led us to that folder and led Khalid Rashid to that folder and to that box, and it was all contained there.
And Deborah, what was that moment like for you and for your family to come across that the way you did?
I'll tell you, we were overwhelmed. We were excited. At the same time, we wanted to be quiet, so we had this quiet level of exhilaration and excitement, and just overwhelmed with emotion, because it was something that we felt was one piece of evidence that, coupled with the evidence that was gathered in the 2004-2006 investigation, that could be used. And we just, some of us fell to our knees, some cried, we held our breath. It was a mixture of emotions, but we were all, I would say, we knew we were onto something. We just weren't quite sure what, and didn't at that time even know what we were going to do next. But we did have an opportunity to gather together, gather ourselves, and think through what we needed to do next. And we called on the expertise of our attorney, Jaribu Hill, who guided us to certified copies, and then give that to the clerk. And that is now held in a safe in the courthouse in LaFleur County in Greenwood, Mississippi.
What do we know about why that warrant wasn't served in 1955?
Well, actually, noted on the back of the warrant, it actually says, and I even have it with me here, it identifies Mrs. Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant as being, by the prosecutor, the figures that should have been served the warrant. But then on the back of this warrant, it says, Mrs. Roy Bryant not found in my county. And that was signed by the sheriff, George Smith. So we know at that time that, and later we heard that because she had small children, they didn't want to bother her. But, being an accomplice in a kidnapping and also a murder later, that's no excuse to not serve a warrant. And we know that warrants aren't, unless they're rescinded, they don't expire. And we know that this is an open murder case, and there's no statute of limitations on murder.
Now, I know that you and the Legacy Foundation, you all are advocating that this warrant be executed, and that she be at least arrested under the terms of this warrant. We know that the FBI spent years reinvestigating this particular case. They were not able to tell that she lied at the time and when she did or did not lie. What if nothing comes of this? What is your reaction then?
Well, this is everything. This is everything to us. It should be everything to our family. And of course, we've been disappointed over the years. This is an open murder case. And so we in the community, the law enforcement, along with the DA in Mississippi, they should be doing everything in their power to make sure that justice prevails. Justice delayed should not be justice denied. And I'll tell you, Brandis, we're not doing this with hate, vengeance, or malice in our heart. Mamie Till Mobley, Emmett's mother, didn't have that, and nor do we. We just want justice to prevail. Now, we want it to work as it should. We want, at the very least, this warrant to be executed. And they have to go through the appropriate and authorities and process to make sure that that happens. I know the headlines say arrest her and all of that, but what we're saying is, at the very least, execute the warrant. We also hope that the DA will impanel a grand jury. And then, yes, truly, we hope for a conviction. But we want justice to prevail. And so right now, we have enough evidence for that.
Okay. And I think we know in the past there have been grand juries that failed to indict her before. This is obviously a new piece. We'll be keeping an eye on it. Deborah Watts, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Monday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7. Local members of Congress join us to discuss the January 6th hearings, gun safety, abortion, and more. And NASA unveils the first full-color images from its new $10 billion space telescopes. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm, and proud sponsor of programming that offers advice and strategies to enhance the physical and mental well-being of fellow legal practitioners in Illinois.
Antiques Roadshow returns with an all-new 25th season, celebrating amazing treasures with incredible personal stories.
The memories that you have from the event are worth more than anything I could put a dollar figure on.
Yeah, and I remember most of it.
Shut the front door, girl. Are you serious?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? That's cute.
Don't miss the must-watch season premiere of Antiques Roadshow American Stories.